My dad went missing about a week ago. He usually calls me Friday nights before he starts drinking, but he doesn't always remember. When he didn't call past Friday, I hardly thought anything of it beyond an assumption that he'd probably started tipping the bottle early and was glued to the TV screen. I know how it sounds, but especially when I was little, he was an excellent father. He only started drinking when my mum got sick, and it only became a problem a few years later, after she lost her battle with breast cancer. I was about 16 then, and we both dealt with the grief in our own way. I turned to thrill-seeking and found myself in the back of a cop car a few times, and he turned to the bottle. Eventually, he got his vice under control, as did I, and only ever drank on the weekends. That was his solution. He could drink himself sick if he wanted to, but only on Friday and Saturday night. Sunday was his day to sober up and sleep it off, and on Monday, he would be back at work. Almost every weekend for the past 10 years, he was in his apartment, drinking alone and watching movies back to back from dawn till dusk. He generally calls me on a Friday night, just before his first sip, to make sure everything is all right and that he doesn't need to go anywhere for the next couple of days. The conversations are usually fast, 5 or maybe 10 minutes long if we have something to talk about. Then he hangs up and I don't hear from him until the following Friday. When he didn't call me last week, I thought it was odd, but nothing beyond that. He'd miss a phone call a few times a year, then later explain he'd gone out to drink with a few of his work buddies, or maybe got home from work early, after a hard day, and didn't want to bother me at work. I feel terrible now thinking about it. Had I thought to call him, I wouldn't be telling this story right now, and instead would be expecting a call from him tonight. I got a call from his boss on Tuesday morning. Randall owns the lumberyard my dad worked at for the past 2 decades. He's one of my dad's closest friends, which isn't saying much since my father's not exactly the friend-having type, but he at least knows my dad well enough to know his routine, his history, and even go out to the bar with him once a month or so. I never got calls from Randall. The only reason for him to have my number in the first place was because I'm his emergency contact. So when I heard his voice on the other end of the phone, I knew something was wrong. "You heard from your dad lately?" he asked in his low East Coast voice that was equally friendly and translucent, depending on how you decided to take it. "He hasn't shown up to work this week." "No," I told him. "Not since the Friday before last." "Well, he hasn't been to work all week, and last week we noticed he'd been acting a little odd. Preoccupied like, and he's been getting thinner too," Randall told me. "None of us thought anything of it at the time, but now that he's not shown up for work, we're thinking something's going on with him he ain't told us." I frowned. "Nothing he's told me. Have you sent anyone over to his place?" "Not yet, but we've got a big order to fill today, and I can't spare anyone, especially with Paul out sick or playing hooky or whatever the Christ he's doing. That's why I thought I'd call you. I know it's a bit out of the way, but even with the drive, you'll get there quicker than any of us will." I pursed my lips. The drive to my father's apartment was just under 2 hours each way. I'd have to carve 4 hours out of my day just to find out he'd broken his rule and kept his bender going. But if he really was still drinking, that would be a problem in and of itself, because he hadn't fallen out of that routine in years. "All right," I conceded. "Let me finish a few things up here, and I'll leave in about an hour." "Thank you, kid. If I hear back from him, or if I get a guy free to run down there, I'll give you a buzz." He hung up without saying goodbye, unsurprising for Randall, but still a bit jarring anyway. I made the necessary arrangements at work, then made the 2-hour drive to my dad's house, hoping to get a phone call before I made it past the halfway point. No such call came, and I eventually found myself parked in the guest parking lot of the small apartment complex. I made one last futile attempt to call his cell phone as I marched up the steps to his apartment, but no answer. I pounded on the door and called his name, then listened for signs of movement on the other side of the door. I reached into my pocket and procured the key he'd given me 5 years ago when he first moved in. I told him it made more sense to give it to Randall or someone at the lumberyard, but he insisted I have it. I turned the key and opened the door, not sure what to expect to find. There was a smell of spoiled food, that hit me first. The kitchen, which was stationed right near the door, was in need of a good cleaning. It didn't look as bad as you see on the hoarder shows, but more like it hadn't been touched in a few weeks. Dishes filled the sink, caked with old, moulded food. Discarded takeout containers were piled next to an overfilled garbage can. "Dad?" I called. "Are you home?" I hadn't thought to check to see if his car was parked in the lot, and I was just about to peek through the window to do so, when I saw a small sliver of light peeking through the crack of the door at the end of the hall. I quickly crossed the room, knowing well that my dad wasn't the type to accidentally leave a light on. I'd been on the receiving end of the "electricity costs money" speech more than I cared to admit when I was a kid. I called him again, but didn't pause to listen. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew that what I'd find when I opened the door would be his lifeless corpse, laying in bed, covered in his own sick. I threw open the door, not even pausing to brace myself for the inevitable. But what I found was absolutely nothing. His room, unlike the rest of the house, was spotless. His bed was made, his shoes were placed in a neat row along the wall, his dresser was clear of dust. The only odd thing about the room at all was a large painting of a carnival that was hung on the wall just opposite the bed, where most people would have hung a television. My dad hadn't ever been the type to care much about art, let alone own a piece of his own, but I would concede that if that had changed, I likely wouldn't know about it. I stood there stupidly, blinking for a few moments as my brain tried to change gears. "Dad?" I called again, although I knew it was pointless. He wasn't there. I turned to leave, when something caught my eye. A book bound in leather, clearly a journal, sat open on his nightstand. In his spidery handwriting, I saw the date of his lost entry. Friday, May 21st, the day he'd missed his phone call. He kept a journal off and on over the years, something a therapist had told him and my mum to do right after her diagnosis. But over the years, the frequency of his journaling had dissipated. I sat down on the foot of his bed, across from the painting, and flipped around the book, looking to see when he'd started writing again. The first day listed this year was in the beginning of May, just a couple of weeks ago. Before that, the last entry was from December a couple of years ago. I took a deep breath and began to read. May 3rd. God, I haven't written in this thing in a while. Had no reason to. I doubt I'd have reason to any time soon if it weren't for that carnival painting I have on my wall. I never cared much for art, see, but my parents did. They had paintings all over the walls when I was a boy, some worth tens of thousands of dollars, according to my mother. But to me, they weren't worth a piss in a rainstorm. That is, except for one. It's this painting of a carnival, the old classic Barnum and Bailey type, with so many people and so much detail that pulled you in the more you looked at it. It was like one of those Where's Waldo puzzles, except there was no Waldo to find. Instead, you could find just about anything you wanted to if you looked hard enough. I remember now spending quite a bit of time staring at that painting, looking for the hidden treasures I hadn't seen before. It was almost a sort of game for me when I was 8 or so. There were people all over, mostly children though, with wide, joyful grins on their faces. They held balloons and popcorn and pretzels and all sorts of other carnival goodies that looked so good and so real you could almost smell the butter and the fat. There were rides too, of course, the egg scrambler, the twirl-a-whirl, but my favourite was the Ferris wheel, towering over the crowd, taking up almost a third of the painting, with the massive white spokes of the Ferris wheel. There were children in every cart, and the cart at the very top is what made the Ferris wheel my favourite. Dressed in baby blue pyjamas, there's this little boy sitting alone in the cart at the top of the Ferris wheel. He looked so happy to be there, even though his cart was the only one with a single passenger. He had brown eyes and sandy hair, and the expression on his face, complete joy and peace and wonder, is a large part of why I think I liked him so much. I wanted him to be happy, and the look on his face made me happy, although I never really understood why. I remember pretending that little boy was my friend, and we would go on adventures together in my backyard, acting like we were pirates, astronauts, or whatever else we liked. I imagined he had a laugh that bubbled from his stomach and burst from his throat in a bubbly choke that sounded so funny that I couldn't help but laugh. I imagined we had sleepovers together, got grounded together, and were the best of friends. I don't remember exactly when I stopped playing with him. Does anyone remember outgrowing their own imaginary friends? I do remember being sad after I imagined him away, but not for long, because he was still there in the painting, happy as ever. I don't remember what happened to that painting exactly. It was there for a long time, and I think I just stopped noticing it as I grew up because it was just always there, like how you can't notice a smell after it's been there for a while. Or maybe someone took it down or replaced it with another painting, but by then I'd grown up and stopped caring about it. If I'm being honest, I wouldn't have remembered the painting at all. Even if someone asked me about it, it was so far back in my mind that it may not have existed at all, like a dream that falls apart like sand in your head after you wake up. But it did exist. I know that, and I remember it so vividly now, because I'm sitting here in my bed, looking up at it. I woke up this morning, and it was just there, as if someone snuck into my room last night and hung it up there while I was asleep. Except I'm sure nobody did, because I checked the doors and windows, and they were all locked, and I would have woken up anyway. I went to take it down, but as I got closer and put my hands on it, my eye caught the look of that little boy in the baby blue pyjamas, sitting at the top of the Ferris wheel. It felt so good to see him again, like running into an old friend at an unexpected place. So I decided to leave it up. It is strange though.